Hi, everyone. So hello, Kotlin people of the internet. So first of all, sincere apologies for the gap between events. As you know, it's been an interesting time and we've all had other concerns. But regular service has now been resumed, we hope. And we're planning to have a BCOG event every couple of months from here on in. So just a few announcements before we get started. So firstly, huge thanks to our two presenters who will be on in just a moment. And then continuing thanks to Zara for managing all the logistics, and of course to Ryan, who controls all the AV magic in the background. So very unfairly, the better he does his job, the less you know he's actually there. Then a few other announcements. So JetBrains ran a Kotlin 1.4 event from October 12th to 15th. So all the material for that is online and well worth a look. Yeah, so that's something to check out. And then the Manning book, Functional Programming in Kotlin. I've been reading that on Meep for the past month or so, and that's now nearing completion. So that's a port of the Scala version, which is very well loved and respected in that community, and it takes you all the way from basic concepts to advanced FP stuff. So that's worth having a look at. And then also having a look at, there's a new release of Spring coming out, Spring 5.3, and that has a bunch of goodies in it if you happen to be a Kotlin developer. For example, coroutines will be formally supported in Spring MVC for the first time. So that's, I think there's a milestone release coming up in about a week or so. And then finally, just to say, we're always on the lookout for presenters. Yeah, so please feel free to step up yourself, or just to throw somebody into the spotlight. That's good as well. So we appreciate that presenting for the first time is a daunting task, especially if you're going to be presenting virtually. I mean, that's a lot harder for the first time than doing it in person. But we're here, and we're happy to help in any way we possibly can. And also pre-recorded talks are fine, as long as you're there in person for the QA, the discussion, and so on. Okay. So that's all the announcements. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Adele to come on and do our first talk. Hello, Adele. Oops. We seem to have lost Adele. I think it may be a connection issue. So shall we call on Ian then? So in the hopes that Adele can be recovered, yeah, I shall call on Ian to very unexpectedly present the second talk for the first time he's done it. So no pressure whatsoever. Over to you, mate. Yeah.
Cool. That was unexpected, but anyway, we'll go ahead anyway. So I'm shifting over to my slides now. Yeah, so today I'm going to look at Ktor and MongoDB. First of all, I'm an Android developer from Ktor. So what we do at Ktor is we are a B2B provider for car rentals. So let's say, for example, you book a car through, let's say, the EasyJet mobile app or through the website. That would be Ktor providing that service. So we kind of make a commission. So that's where we make money on the commission.
Sorry, Ian. Sorry to break in. I think we're having a slight problem with your slides. Would you mind stopping sharing and then resharing? Just so
yeah,
we can
no problem.
up again. Sorry about that.
No problem.
I'll disappear again.
Sharing again now. Everything okay?
Yeah, we're just not seeing your slides. So just switch over to your slides and hopefully we'll see them. I think there's a lag with a screen share.
Can we see now?
Not yet. Hang on a second. Let me go and see whether I can check to see whether things are working right. Okay, there we go. That's us working now.
Everything okay now?
Yeah, all good. Carry on.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that, guys. Trying to organized there in the background. So yeah, I'm back to my slides now. So let's start again. So basically today I'm going to introduce you to Ktor and MongoDB. So we're going to build a RESTful application with Ktor and MongoDB Atlas. So this is a cloud provider. So first of all, I'm from Ktor. I probably said that already. So I'll just jump into the presentation now. So what is Ktor? So Ktor is a lightweight framework to write server-side applications purely in Kotlin. So this is a Kotlin framework built from the ground up. But you're probably wondering what's actually special about Ktor, because you probably use Spring, particularly Spring Boot. So you're probably wondering what's actually special about Ktor. With Ktor, you can write a small microservices with less boilerplate, and that is achieved through a Kotlin DSLs. It's asynchronous, and of course it uses DSL. So Ktor is actually built with coroutines from the very ground up. So that's why it's actually asynchronous. So that's why they take a lot of the Kotlin goodies within Ktor. And it is open source and completely free. And should I say fun? So here's just a piece of code snippet from the actual Ktor documentation on the life cycle of Ktor. You're probably wondering like what the hell is going on here. So let's just jump into this bit by bit. So everything is represented as a pipeline, and these are individual phases. So let's just go to the first one, which would be the setup phase. So here essentially when the first time you make your request, it's going to set up that call for you, and it's going to process any attributes you may have. And then it will go to the monitoring phase. So let's say, for example, let's say you have any error handling, that would be in this phase. And then it will go to the features phase. So let's say, for example, if I have default headers, this will install that feature for me at this phase. So essentially, let's say, for example, if you have another feature as well, say coin, for example, if you want to have a dependency injection, you can install that as well at this phase. And you can also have an interceptor at this phase if you want to create your own custom features. So it is kind of a flexible Ktor as opposed to maybe the other frameworks that you might use. And here we have the call phase. So this is just going to process that call and send back the end user a response. Pretty self-explanatory. And then it might deal with any fallbacks. Let's say if any errors, it will call this phase. Now, so that might look a bit, what the heck is going on there? So I'm a visual person, so I like to kind of visualize everything. So here is a simple diagram inspired by an article that I've read a few weeks back. So everything here be represented as a pipeline. And here we have different phases. So here we have a request. So once you make that request, it's going to go to these individual phases and spit out back a response. And you also could have different interceptors at these phases. So you can create your own interceptor to intercept these particular phases. The most common one that you probably write an interceptor for would be the features phase. So let's say, for example, if you wanted to override headers, for example, and you want to create your own authorization rows, you most likely would be using an interceptor in this case. So that's just an example, but I'll show you how all this works in the demo. Just this is the first thing that you might see in a Ktor application is this DSL block called routing. So essentially this is a function. So everything in Ktor is just a function. So this routing is essentially a feature. So within this routing feature is where I set up my entry points. So let's say, for example, I have a HTTP method get. You call this function called get. And let's say here I might want to show a home page, for example. If I wanted to have a specific path, I can do that by just passing in a parameter called /conferences, and you can do whatever inside that function block, lambda. And the same for a post as well. You can do the exact same in the exact same syntax. So what actually that might look like in a visual form. In the diagram here, you probably have your entry point dot / and then you say, I have a method called get. I do this sequence. So it's kind of like a tree diagram. And then the next phase would be, let's say, a get request and /conferences. I do that here. And then at the same tree level, I will have a post request. That's the best way to kind of visualize this kind of code. This will all become very clear in the demo. So this sounds cool. So that's just a brief introduction to Ktor, but the documentation has support for SQL. I don't like SQL from my personal experience. You may like it, and that's fine. But if I'm doing a very small project, since I'm an Android developer and I like to have some side projects, and I just wanted to basically create a very fast and lightweight background service. And I discovered that I didn't want to use SQL in this case, because I don't like the ceremony, like the migration or the constraints, like the primary keys and the foreign keys. So this is where MongoDB enters the picture, and this is suited my use case very well, and it also might suit your use case as well. So what is MongoDB? So direct quote from Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a general purpose document-based distributed database built for modern developers and for the cloud era. That might be a mouthful, but the keyword here is document-based. So everything is considered a collection. So essentially, it's just a JSON document schema. So that's JSON drives that document schema. So essentially, it's just a document, and you can scale that up as much as you want. In this talk, though, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the cloud part. So I have discovered Mongodb Atlas. This is not a new product, by the way. These guys were formerly known as MLab. So if you have previous experience in using MLab, so MLab was a database service for MongoDB. So essentially, I can host a database in the cloud. So essentially on somebody else's computer. So basically what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, host my database, you do the scaling up for me, and I just do the operations as I wish. This is good for Azure teams who'd rather spend time actually building the application as opposed to, let's say, for example, I don't want to be the one that's administrating the database all the time, whereas I can delegate that to this service, MongoDb Atlas. So that's really good if you're in an Azure team and you just want to focus on building your RESTful application or whatever that might be. Also, my favorite thing about this platform is it allows you to pick your own cloud provider. So let's say, for instance, you might use Google Cloud Platform. You can use that if you wish. You might use Microsoft Azure, and the most common one at AWS. So if you're in, if your company stack is using any of these, you have the freedom to choose, which is very nice. So just what we're going to build today, just to give you an idea. We are just going to build a very simple conference management dashboard. Probably not a good memo for 2020, but we'll do it anyway. So here we're going to create a RESTful CRUD app with CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete. And we're going to have MongoDb Atlas host my NoSQL cloud database. Just before we get into that, I just want to make sure that we won't be covering these following topics. Authentication. Since I don't have a use case for this talk around authentication, I recommend check out the Ktor documentation and how that works. It's actually relatively straightforward. We have session management. I won't be covering that today. And testing. My intention is not to bore you today, so I won't be covering testing, but you can have a look at that in your own time. So let's jump out of the slide into my IDE. But first, maybe I want to jump to the MongoDB setup. So here I'm at the dashboard for Conferences DB. So here you have your cluster. But first, before I jump into this, if you want to create your own, you will get this kind of dialogue, something very similar like this. So the first thing when you create your database service, you're going to configure a number of things. First thing you'll be configuring is your cluster, what zone you want it to be in. That's up to you. I picked the Irish zone because I'm from there. So here, and then you also have the option here to choose your own provider, whether that's going to be AWS, Google Cloud, or Microsoft. That's up to you. That's kind of a very good option to have. And here you get the option to choose the number of pricing plans. I'm using the free tier because I don't want to be charged money for this. So I just went for the free tier because my hobby project is not going to have a lot of traffic. But if you're in your use case, you may want to go for a different tier, and you could do that through here. So you got a number of replicas that you may want, like you got a number of RAM, storage, CPU. So there's different types of pricing plans that you may want. That's entirely up to you. Whatever use case you have these number of pricing plans. For me, I'm just going to use the free one. And you also have additional settings. Most importantly, the version of MongoDB. So let's say, for example, if you're migrating, let's say if you have 4.1, for example, and you don't want to migrate straight into 4.2 in case of breaking changes, for example, you have that option in the pricing tier to change that version. And there's some other configuration that you can do in your own time. That's an idea of how you would set up your cloud provider. Here is back to the dashboard. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but you have additional kind of tools at your disposal that you can use. You can get some insights into your database. This is not available on the free one, of course, but you will get some insights how your database is performing, get some metrics as well. So it gives you an idea of how your database is performing. So let's jump into the goodie bits. So here is my collections. This might take a while to load, but ideally here you're going to see your database with a number of collections. Yep. So here I have my database, Conference DB. Here I have a number of collections. The one I'm going to be looking at is this one. So here at the moment, I already have preloaded objects in my database. So that's the kind of general idea of MongoDB in the cloud. So let's jump to IntelliJ and show you exactly how the application will work. Here I'm in IntelliJ. So here I want to first show you the build.gradle file. So here is just a very simple KTS file. So here we got a number of dependencies that I'm setting up. These are just versions that I'm calling. Here I have plugins. I'm using Kotlin on the JVM with the latest version. I'm also using this kind of shadow jar plugin. I'm not going to cover this because I don't want to cover the deployment in this talk, but you can have a look at the repo afterwards because I will share the link on GitHub later on. So here I just want to show you some of the dependencies I'm using. So the one that I want to point out is kmongo. So here I'm using a wrapper library to basically do my MongoDB operations. And this is very, very handy because it's really, really fast. I actually did these CRUD operations in a matter of half an hour. So I'll see how that works in just a moment. So here I'm going to jump to my application.kts file. But first, I just want to show you the kind of the structure that I've set up here. So here I just set up a kind of a package structure here with a controller and have my DI package folder for dependency ingestion. Here is just my data classes. Pretty straightforward, not too complicated there. Here's a repository, which I'll show later. And then we got service class. But first, I want to jump into the most important part. Here in Ktor, you will have this entry point called function main, which will incept an arguments. And what I'm running is on an embedded server. So I'm running on a Netty server. You may want to use Tomcat, but I haven't seen any examples of Tomcat in Ktor. So I stuck with Netty in this case. So what will happen here is I will just start my application and it will load that for me. But first, I want to go to the application module. Now, everything in Ktor is broken up into modules. So I can have a number of one or more modules. So this is entirely up to you. So let's say if you want to have some smaller services, you want to break those up into different modules, that's up to you. And how you would do that is driven by the application.conf file. So here in the resources, you will have this folder. So what this folder is going to do is a Hakoon file. A bit of a mouthful. It's actually called human object config notation. This is just another fancy way of displaying JSON in a human readable format, as opposed to maybe YAML, for example. So here I'm just setting up a couple of things for deploying my application, what port I want to use. Here I just set up an environment variable. You can hard code this to 8080 if you want, that's up to you. Here I'm using a flag called watch. Now this is really, really interesting because in this case here, I am basically saying for every code change that happened inside my module, please reload the application. And that's very, very productive because you don't want to keep reloading the application manually. So this will do that for you out of the box, which is really, really cool. And here we have inside the applications node is where I define a number of modules. Here in this case, I just have one module. You can define as many modules as you want. That's entirely up to the architecture of your application. And here I have a custom parameter that I want to define here for my Mongo UI, so I can connect to that database. Here I have if I wanted to deploy my application, I set up a custom environment variable for that too. So that's the application.conf file, and that's quite important for configuring your application as you go. So let's jump back into the application.conf file. So first of all, I want to discuss the install. So every time you want, let's say, a feature, you would use install. So here I'm just installing default headers. So that will just give me a timestamp, user agent, etc., etc. You can customize this if you want, but I'm just using the default headers. And then I also have another feature for content negotiation. So I want to be able to give back the end user back a JSON format. I can do that through here. So here I'm using Jackson in this instance. You can use any serialization you want. You can use the new one, Kotlin serialization or JSON. It's entirely up to you. And then I can set up a course configuration as well. This is actually pretty handy because I have to write less code, which is very, very nice. So I just define the methods that I want to use and so forth. And then here I have the kind dependency injection. Here I'm just installing a couple of modules that I've defined. So let's jump to that now. Very, very straightforward. I just have a module. I set up my dependencies. I'll show you that in just a little bit. And here I'm basically saying to read that environment variable, my Mongo UI. So I want to be able to read that from this Hakoon file. So then I also set up my dependencies for my coding client. Now this is the actual library that I'm using, which is the KMongo wrapper library. So let's dig into that, shall we? So I'm just gonna show you exactly how that works. So inside here, I have my repository package. So inside here, I'm injecting that client. So essentially, first of all here, I'm also setting up the collection that I want to use. So in this case, essentially, it's like a builder. So what I do is I get the database that I want. You put in a string. This is just a constant. This is a constant file, nothing too tricky there. Here I say what database I want to use and also what collection do I want to use. As you can see here, that's minimal configuration, which is very good. So I can go ahead and start doing my database operations. So first thing I might want to do is I might want to insert my operation. I can do that through a suspend function. Now you're probably realizing, is that actually using coroutines? Yes, it is. This library essentially is handling all of those coroutines in the background for me. So I don't have to do anything about that. That will handle all of the exceptions for me, which is very, very neat. So that means all I have to do is just say call insert one, and I pass in the object that I want to insert into my collection. That's really, really handy and less lines of code. And also I might want to, let's say, find all of the collections. I do that through, I call my collection again, and I say I want to find all of those items in that collection, and I transfer them to a list. That's pretty straightforward again, and the same for the other ones as well. So you have here find one conference, delete. You also have a method for that too, and you also have a method for update one item in your database. So that's actually pretty straightforward and less code to write, which is great. So let's jump back into the application. So that's what that's doing. So that's going to inject that for me into the repository. That's all done. Now we have the service class. Now this is just another class for encapsulation. You don't have to use this. You can just use this repository class directly. That's okay. I just decided that I wanted to be able to unit test this in isolation. That's entirely up to you. Ktor doesn't force you to use a particular architecture in a way. You can architecture the app in whatever way you want. So the flexibility is on you. So if I go back to application.config, sorry if I'm switching back and forth, but here I have the most important part of this talk, which is the routing. So this is where you make your HTTP operations. Now I've kind of created a class for this. Well, not a class really, more of a function really. So everything in Ktor is built by functions. So here I have a route function. So essentially saying an extension function. Inside that, I define another function for a route. Here, I'm just kind of saving myself to repeat myself. I just define this path once for each of these blocks. So that's once that's done. I would do, let's say, for example, our first call would be a get call. So let's say in this case, I say get requests. I just use this function called call. And what I want to do is I want to respond with something, okay? So I want to respond with a okay status, and I will call my service to get all of those conferences and display them in a response. And I'll do the same for, let's say, if you want to have a parameters, you can do that through /ID. So let's say here, for example, I want to get the parameter that I passed in. I can just do call.parameters, which is a set. So what I do is I basically find that parameter ID, this guy, and then I would do is I want to call the service class to find that particular conference, and then I will do a kind of a nullability check, and then I will basically respond with something, and I want to respond with that conference. And the same for the rest of them as well. There's something different about the posts. So I have to infer the type of what type I want, which is conference. So I need to infer that type of conference. And then what I'll do is I respond with created. So in this case, I'm saying I want to create this object, and then I'll just call my service to insert that into the database. And the same for put. You can also have a HTTP method for put as well. Here I'm essentially saying get me the body that I want. I can use this function called receive or null. So in this case, please retrieve of this type conference, which is my data class, by the way. And then what I do is I just want to respond with that object that's being updated. And the same for delete as well. And here I just very similar to the get path. So that's essentially my Ktor CRUD application. So what should this look like? So I'm going to jump now into Postman to show you how this will work. But first, I want to run this application. So what happens is when I run this application, I can do this through here. So I run my function. So let's hope this runs. Yes, it did. That's good. So what will happen here is it's going to load my application.conf file that we talked about. So this is going to read this guy first. It's going to read the configuration. So here I passed in environment variable to port 8080. So I've actually set this environment variable in the background. And it's also going to watch this class for any changes and so forth. And also reads the Mongo URI that I have from my database. So that's established the connection to my MongoDB database. And here I am going to show you the response and requests. So here I am in Postman. You may also want to use curl. That's up to you. You can use that. That's fine. I'm not hardcore like you guys with your curl commands. So here I have a collection that I've created. So here I'm going to basically call retrieve conferences. This is just going to retrieve a list of conferences just like this. So what I do is I define a URL. I created an environment variables here, but essentially it's calling localhost 8080 in this case, /conferences. So do a get request. So let's do that now. Yep. So here we have a get response with a list of conferences. So here, let's say we have DryCon London here, for example. Here we have Kotlin Conf here as well. So you kind of get the idea here. Very simple get requests. So let's say if I just wanted to retrieve one conference, I can do that just by taking this ID. And let's say if I want to, yeah. So in this case here is another get request. But in this case, I just want to retrieve a single conference in this case. Let's fire this guy off. So here is returned DryCon London, just to make sure that was the right one. Yep. So I've returned the DryCon London one in this case. But what if there was a new conference that was upcoming and I want to know about that? Let's do that now. So we can do a post request. So let's say if people want to go to DryCon San Francisco, I can do that through here. So maybe you don't get the 2020 memo and you might not want to travel to San Francisco, but let's do it for demonstration purposes. So here, do a post request. Here I've created my object. I've inserted that. Also on good, but what if I want to check that's been there? We can go back to the conferences. We scroll down. We can see that our object is being inserted. Now, we might want to change to status to maybe something a little bit more realistic. Let's say we want to know, instead of upcoming, we might want to put this to online status instead of upcoming, because we know people are not going to travel there physically. We can do that through the update operation here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to update this conference. So I'm going to make sure the ID is corresponding with that one. So what I'm going to do here is update my status to online. So let's do that now. So now I've updated the operation, all good. But what if I don't like America anymore and I just want to get rid of them from the dashboard? Let's do that now because I'm probably sick of Americans at this stage. So now I'm going to remove this from the database through a delete operation. So I have deleted that. Let's check if it actually was deleted. We can check that again through get requests. Yep, it's definitely removed from existence. So that's the general idea of a CRUD application in Ktor. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to jump back now into the slides. Hopefully you will see this time. So that's the demo. If you want to see the source code for yourself, please go to this URL on GitHub. But if you also want to see a client-side example of this backend, you can go to this URL Conference Finder, which is a Kotlin multi-platform application. So if you want to see how it works on multiple clients, go to this URL. Just to give you some resources that you might want to look at, you can look at the official documentation, ktor.io. They've recently redesigned the documentation, so I recommend checking that out. Very good resources in there. And also, of course, the Ktor roadmap, which was released just recently. So you get an idea of what's coming down the line. I believe they are kind of doing a lot of refactoring, but they kind of are very vague about that. So they're doing something about that refactoring. I think they want to remove all of the JVM dependencies and try and move towards a multi-platform. They're multi-platform on the client, but not on the backend. So that's something they're working on towards their roadmap. And of course, if you want to do the MongoDB on the cloud, you can go to this link and set that up yourself. And of course, the wrapper library that I was using. And yeah, there's also a good article. I don't know why that's not there anymore. I'll share that later. Yeah, so that's it from me. I'll try to answer the questions as best as I can.
Excellent. Listen, thank you very much, Ian, for a very, very comprehensive talk there. Just a few questions to ask. First of all, whenever you were using this at work, was there any pushback, whenever you first adopted it? Did they think that Ktor was too new?
Oh, yeah, it's a good question. So when I started looking at Ktor, it was a lot of there wasn't a lot of good documentation on it. I was using it when I was using the old documentation. I was getting very confused, so I had to figure out a lot myself.
Yep.
So I had to go and look at some articles on Medium to actually understand how Ktor worked. So I think maybe I think the problem with Ktor was that they had only about 4 developers working on it at one point.
Yep.
So I don't think they realized what the scale was going to be like.
Yes.
So yeah, I do think the learning curve is actually quite easy compared to, let's say, Spring, for example.
Yes.
Spring would be a little bit more of a learning curve as opposed to Ktor.
Yes, cool. And then is there anything in Ktor or in Mongo that in retrospect you wish you had and you really miss from any of the other frameworks that you've used?
So you're saying as in comparison to SQL frameworks?
Oh yeah, just in general, comparing Mongo to SQL databases or comparing Ktor to other RESTful frameworks that you might have seen.
Yeah, I've only used Spring Boot. So in Spring Boot, I've used MongoDB. So I have more experience with using MongoDB in Spring Boot.
Yes.
So I think I was looking for something very, very similar. So that's why I didn't like the SQL documentation on it.
Yes.
I was like, can I find anything about MongoDB? So I had to go finding things, and I found this wrapper library called KMongo, which is very similar to how you do the in the Spring Boot implementation. So I was looking for something very similar.
Yep.
And I found that. So I just don't like SQL. So
fair enough. Absolutely, Grant. And then finally, just because you were talking about coin there, do you think that's something that's needed these days, or now that we're all doing microservices, is a dependency injection container still as vital as it used to be, or is it something whose kind of day is past, do you think?
In the terms of coin, I only use that just to get up and running quite quickly.
Yes.
So that's why I use coin as opposed to manual dependency ingestion. You may use other frameworks in like Dagger, for example, or you may want to use this Spring Boot dependency ingestion frameworks as well. It's a tricky situation, to be honest. I think Ktor is quite early to tell what the best dependency ingestion framework for that is. Yep. I don't think they're going to recommend what the best framework to use. I think that's entirely up to you.
Cool.
So I think it's more of a flexible choice.
Excellent. Very good. Well, once again, Ian, thank you so much. We'll bring you back at the end for the final round of questions. But if I can dismiss you at this stage, and if I can call Adele back again, who I believe is on a more reliable network. So are you receiving? Are you receiving?
Yes, I am. My boyfriend's a software engineer as well, and he just likes to have lots of networks, and I never know which one's the right one, but we're on the right one now.
Excellent. I shall leave you to it then. Good. Very good.
Okay, so thanks for the introduction there, Garth, and welcome everyone. So also a special thanks to Ian for stepping into the first slot at literally a moment's notice. So my name is Adele, and I am really excited to be here this afternoon. We do only have about 30 minutes, but I'm aiming to wrap it up in 20-25 minutes so we can have some Q&A at the end. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat as you think of them, and hopefully we get to them. But if not, you can always reach me on Twitter. There's my handle on the slide there. So it's at @IM_Carpenter. So currently I'm working as a software engineer at Trifork Amsterdam. Trifork is a project-based JVM-focused software development company, and we hire out self-sufficient teams to complete projects for customers. It really is a tech company for techies. You will find our CEO from time to time rolling up his sleeves and debugging for a customer. We are also the company behind the go-to conferences, which you might have heard of. Anyway, my career at Trifork actually started 2 years before I started programming. So in a sense, I was a programmer before I could write a line of code. It sounds a little odd, but let me explain. In that 2 years at Trifork, I had a few roles, mostly in sales and marketing for the go-to conferences. That meant I had a front row seat at some high quality tech events. I met many talented people, attendees, sponsors, and speakers alike, such as the Instill crew that helped put this event together today. Being in sales, it was my job to understand the product and the intended audience. What made them tick? Why would they come to a conference? It didn't take long during this research phase for my full nerd to come out. Even though I had no idea what was being said half the time, gradually as I went to more events and met more people, I did start to develop an understanding of the tech landscape. I became adept at throwing out one-liners at the right moment to stimulate a discussion. See, that's a nice choice for embedded systems. You know COBOL, but you're so young. But monoliths can be sexy. JavaScript, ew. After a year on the sidelines, I decided I wanted in on the action. And naturally, I decided to celebrate this moment of enlightenment by getting myself a backpack that any developer would be proud of. When I thought about becoming a programmer, I knew that I would need to pick a language. I knew it didn't really matter which one I started with. The main thing I needed to learn was the manner in which computers must be spoken to. In other words, logic. So I dove into a book about learning to program as a beginner in Kotlin. You can see it there on the desk. I actually won that book at the Kotlin Conf where I met the Instill crew, and I took it as a sign to just start learning. I started my programming journey learning about the core beginner topics such as data structures, control flow, types, classes, objects, functions, as well as important Kotlin concepts of nullability and immutability. I came back to work after 2 weeks off with a spring in my step. I had a sense of what it all meant rather than being lost in the dark. That excitement was short-lived. I asked one of my colleagues what I needed to do to keep learning and getting better. Build something, he said. Like what? I thought to myself. Eventually, being a fan of RuPaul's Drag Race, I decided on a simple web app that generates random drag queen names. It would be built in Spring Boot and Kotlin. Only 2 technologies. How complex can it be, right? Let's quickly go through all the technologies that I used in that first app. So it was a Spring Boot app written in Kotlin. not so scary. But of course, Spring Boot includes this lot. But that's not everything, because I don't want to use an embedded database, but I also don't want to install MySQL. And I'm going to need a front end. And and I need to build it somehow. And at that time, the Kotlin DSL hadn't really taken off, so I went for the standard Groovy. And of course, I wasn't writing this thing in a text editor, so also let's not forget IntelliJ. But of course, that's not all, because I need a vocabulary to describe what I'm doing. Not only so I can verbalize any issues to another person, but for my inner monologue as I work. And of course, while my vocabulary was growing, these definitely became my favorites, especially in those really, really early days. So that I could take my colleagues' advice to build something seriously, when I returned to work after my 2-week Kotlin immersion, I negotiated with my employer to have 2 dev days a week. The setup was that I would spend 2 days in the office learning to code and spend the other 3 days earning my keep in marketing. This arrangement lasted about 6 months, and in that time, I managed to build 2 web apps using Spring Boot and Kotlin, the drag name generator and a lunch rating app for the office. With the help of my colleagues, I even got the lunch app running in production, and had set up a continuous delivery pipeline in GitLab. So I could push to master, and bam, my changes are there on a real life server. As someone who thought the command line was magic only 7 months earlier, this felt like the coolest thing I had ever done. I wanted more. Meanwhile, I had noticed an interesting thing happening over those 6 months. Many of my colleagues who had known me as the marketing girl or the conference organizer had actually enjoyed supporting my programming quest by teaching me what they knew. They seemed invested in my progress, kept asking when I would be put on a project. They actually wanted to work with me. So the next step was clear. I needed to be on a real-life custom project. When I approached my CEO, who, by the way, is almost the complete opposite of this guy on the slide here, he had his doubts that I could progress beyond a few toy projects, which honestly, could you blame him? Here I am, someone who didn't know what open source was when she interviewed 2.5 years ago, and only 7 months ago opened Terminal for the first time. And now she wants to write code that our customers pay good money for? Amazingly, he responded to my request by saying, "We can only try." We can only try. I felt like the luckiest person in the world. I had already been chatting with one of the teams, so I officially asked them if I could join. The answer was yes. So I'd done it. I'd found myself a team and a project. And to make the deal even sweeter, it was server-side Kotlin. Happy days. But of course, I really had no idea what lay ahead. A project where one of the 5 services we were responsible for was written in Kotlin, where parts of the code base were written in 2012 and still use Spring 4, where our team has 4 customers, each with a different implementation of the core service. It is large and overwhelming and awesome. I am now a year into this project and just starting to get my head around all the moving parts. If I had my time again, I would do many things differently, but you don't know what you don't know. So here's my experience of some things that I've learned along the way. The first lesson actually came the second I said out loud, I want to learn to program. It was at this moment that I realized that if I was going to have any hope of success, I would need to leave my ego at the door, accept the affordances that being a complete novice provides, embrace uncertainty, be comfortable not knowing things. And then later, I realized that this mindset must be there to stay. There is always going to be more to learn. I am comfortable not knowing stuff, and I'm continuously building awareness of stuff I might need to know later. As a noob, this is the only way to stay sane, and it is a core skill of the programming profession. So when I was confronted with the growing list of technologies in my first attempt to build something, I had to realize that there was literally no way that I could build anything, no matter how small, if I didn't abstract the internals of these things away. It's now 18 months on, and Spring Boot is still a lot of magic to me, and that's okay. I'm at peace knowing that there are lots of things that I don't know yet, but I can always learn the details when I need them. In the now famous words of Donald Rumsfeld, known unknowns are better than unknown unknowns. So I guess there's some people here that has been in a meeting where someone could be you, has said, wait, let's just step back for a minute. It's fairly common, and I've heard it more times than I care to remember, both in and out of programming land. And the person that says it either comes across as a know-it-all or a genius, but never as an idiot. It's because we all understand, at least on an intellectual level, how important and necessary good abstractions are. It's just that we can be notoriously bad at it in practice. Like a beagle on the trail, it's easy to get caught up on the rabbity scent of working out the technical details while ignoring the call of dinner time. I have learned that making progress as an engineer means developing a keen sense of what is worth investment right now and what isn't. It is making a choice about what to do, what details to ignore, and trusting your judgment in that. Abstraction is just one of the tools we use to form that judgment. And just like any tool, the more you use it, the better you get at using it. The next lesson I learned was probably the biggest, in that I've applied it to almost every area of my life. I'm a product of the way that many children, girls in particular, are raised. Be good, go to school, get good grades, don't make too many mistakes, you will be rewarded. I held on to this mantra for way too long, but it was for the better part shattered once I started working as a developer. I remember those first few days being frozen in analysis paralysis, wondering what on earth I'm supposed to be doing. Wonder if I was doing the right thing and holding my breath every time I made a change, praying I hadn't broken what I'd already done. Sure, it sounds dramatic, but inside your own head can be a very tense place. I was in the middle of one of these fear loops when one of my colleagues approached me. Let's call him Malcolm. "How are you going?" Malcolm asked. I'm pretty sure he knew already from the deep frown I was sporting. "Oh, it's hopeless," I said. "I've achieved nothing today. It just won't work." And he said, very matter-of-factly and without a hint of sarcasm, "Oh, so you're learning a lot then?" My frown changed to be one of confusion rather than frustration, with one eyebrow slightly raised. "Huh?" I thought to myself. Malcolm smiled. "It always sticks better when you have gone through a lot of pain to figure it out. I still have those days. You are becoming a real programmer now." I realized in that moment that I'd been lying to myself. I claim that learning is something that I value, but here I am frustrated because I'm not producing anything. And I had made the dangerous connection that experiencing failure, no matter how small, meant that I was a failure. For me, the realization that failure is learning runs a lot deeper than learning from your mistakes and iterating until you get it right. For me, it's liberation from perfectionism. So I had learned that iteration and Googling could get me a long way in programming. But of course, that isn't the whole story. As I moved from working on narrowly defined tickets to more complicated ones, my focus shifted from general programming concepts to project specifics. Why is the project built this way and not that? Which machine do I need to log into to view assessment or question data? Which service is responsible for this API? What other endpoints are available? Can I make modifications? I do not have the right data to reproduce locally. How do I go about reproducing this issue in dev or acceptance? It was when I started asking these questions, which inconveniently coincided with the first work from home orders, I realized the importance of good documentation. I had been working predominantly on 2 user-facing services, which are essentially a layer on top of a large core service. As part of my investigation for a ticket, I needed to trigger an event from the core service locally and see how it was handled in one of these user-facing services. I had set up the local environment for the core service when I first joined the team, but it had been months since I ran it. I opened the project and tried to run it. No dice. Double-checked the docs, made sure I hadn't missed anything. Everything is set up as it should be. So I asked one of my colleagues for a Zoom. We spent the next couple of hours troubleshooting. We made decent progress, but sure enough, as one thing is resolved, another issue pops up. And where I keep drawing a blank, my colleague keeps coming up with ideas of things to try. In the end, after running a few scripts, making some edits to the configuration, and clean building half a dozen times, we got it up and running. I thank her and recap all the things that we tried so that I would have a reference for next time. She suggests that I add the list to the docs as it would be useful for her future self as well. The requests really struck me. In some way, I didn't feel experienced enough to update the docs. I was happy to sit around and complain about them because someone somewhere in the past should have definitely predicted the precise information that I would need today. The insight from my colleague that we write docs for our future selves was key. It took away the feeling that I had nothing useful to contribute because I was new and less experienced. I can barely remember my own age. This is true. I only remember my date of birth, let alone the exact steps that I took to troubleshoot something 3 months ago. Since then, I've also learned that by being actively engaged with the docs, you learn to trust them more. I've been burned a couple of times by documentation that was just completely out of date, where I wasted hours trying to figure out what's going on before realizing the truth. And at the risk of contradicting myself, no docs would have been better than wrong docs. Documentation is somewhat of a dirty word in the Agile world as it conjures up images of thick binders sitting on dusty shelves. But that's not what I see at all. Good documentation doesn't need to be long. It can be quite simple. If there are quirks in the project, write it in the README. Brain dump in a troubleshooting section. If you see a Java doc that is out of date or just plain wrong, fix it. It doesn't need to be a perfectly edited journalistic masterpiece. It just needs to be there, and it needs to be up to date. Your future self and noobs like me will thank you. So I have been a little unfortunate with my timing in becoming a programmer. I was working with my team for only 6 months when we received the first work from home orders. I'm thankful it wasn't any earlier, but it was still a tricky transition, just as I was starting to find my feet. I was completing my work in a lot more isolation than I would have liked. As we all know, we can always Zoom or Slack, but it's never quite the same, and you miss a lot of incidental learning and conversations. So in this environment, structured collaboration has become somewhat of a learning lifeline for me. My team has a 4 eyes policy, which often takes the form of a code review. And over the last 6 months, I have come to rely on the reviews in a much larger way than I expected I would. They are basically all of my, hey, can you come and have a look at this moments from a week or so, compressed into one merge request. And by highlighting this, I don't mean to extend the war and peace that is literature already written about what makes a good code review or how important collaboration is. All I want to do is leave you with a general reminder about how valuable valuable they are for noobs, particularly in the times that we live in. In preparation for this event, I actually watched a talk from our host Garth and his colleague Amon, where they made a really nice point about how it's not actually a code review, it's a design review. So with that in mind, here are the kinds of things that are helpful in a review and those that are less so. So one of the first things I noticed is the delivery of the code review. This stood out to me because I had experienced this before when I was working as a marketing content editor and coach. I learned then that unless you're a really cohesive team that has been working together for a long time, simply starting a comment thread is inefficient at best. A content or design review can only work as a conversation, even better if it's in front of a whiteboard, virtual or otherwise. Even better if it's actually conducted before a line of code is written. Let's just call it a code preview. By that, I mean a discussion on how to solve the problem in the context of the project. This is something I've gotten better at initiating and have found it really beneficial. A lot of you probably do it without thinking. For me, it's basically a conversation along the lines of, I have these requirements, I see these ways to solve it, but I'm not sure which fits in with the project the best. What would be your approach? I have found that this guidance earlier on makes both completion and review more efficient and enjoyable. I found this equally true in programming and in content creation. And when it comes to giving feedback, I've found that it lands best when used as a moment to share your experience rather than initiate a heated discussion of tabs versus spaces, which I'm sure none of you do, right? For example, some of the most useful comments I have received are along the lines of, extract this as a method, use the shortcut Command-Option-M. There is a function or class already in the project that does basically this same thing. Is it possible to use it? We have a library on the class path that has lots of nice functions that handle this situation. You can replace this for loop with a for each, flat map, or map. Here's how. So to sum up, no matter how deep we get into our programming journey, there is always going to be more to learn. To keep our sanity and focus as we go, make wise use of abstractions. When things don't work out the way that we want, take comfort in that failure is learning. And in the day-to-day, remember that well-written documentation is important and collaboration matters. But for now, the thanks comes from me. I do really appreciate you dropping in today, and I look forward to your questions. If you don't get yours answered today, you can reach me on Twitter. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Adele. So Grant, thank you so much for the talk. So just a few questions here. One from myself, first of all. I was listening to you talking there about the abstraction rabbit hole, and my father was a huge fan of jazz, so I was just thinking heavy. You know, that's a really heavy realization. You know, normally it takes a good few years as a programmer before people appreciate that. So how do you think it hit you so quickly? How do you think you realized the problems of abstraction so quickly?
I think it's pretty clear that I'm not 21. I'm actually, north of 30. So I actually started programming a lot later, and I had other work experience in different industries. So I had, I guess, a broader base to draw from. Also, I came into programming in a really strange way because I worked at the GoTo conferences and also at Kotlin Conf. And what it meant was I was introduced to all of these high-level concepts really early. So I didn't start with, this is how you use the command line. I started with, this is how you build a microservices architecture. Yeah. And so starting with that sort of more higher level view, when I came to actually learn the tools, that sort of just came to me really naturally.
Cool. Fascinating. Very good. Yeah. In fact, something I sometimes recommend to people is when going near a new subject, just read a book that's far too complicated for you, because then you get an idea of where you're going and you see what all the advanced things are that you will eventually bump into, you know. So just on the Kotlin language, what was the worst part for you of learning Kotlin? What did you find hardest in the language?
I actually think it was just that Stack Overflow is full of Java, and so when I was learning, the documentation wasn't quite as good, and the number of blog posts was lower, the number of exact questions you were looking for on Stack Overflow was lower, and also the Kotlin support from Spring was really quite new as well. So for me, it was just finding the answers to questions that I had. And it does sound a little odd, but yeah, at my work, I'm surrounded by Java developers and they know a bit of Kotlin. And at home, my boyfriend is also a Java developer. So I kind of shot myself in the foot a little, maybe, but I wouldn't change a thing. And the book that I used was really, really great. It just, it abstracted a lot of things away from me. So by focusing on a book for 2 weeks, I didn't look at the internet for those first 2 weeks. I just went through basically the syllabus. I put my student hat on. And that just meant that I could just focus on a specific line of learning and then bring in more complexity later.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Yeah, I think that's a thing with all newer languages. I'm old enough to remember when Java was new, and if you ask somebody in the office a Java question, they went, "Well, I only need know C++, and that's how you do it in C++." So it'll probably be something like that, you know. Yep. So then, now that you're one of us now, you know, one of us. So you're a developer now, but whenever you were making the transition, what did you find most strange about developers as a species? You know, was there anything that really surprised you?
Well, I'm a nerd at heart. I am. I was a complete math science geek at school. I actually studied civil engineering first. So I have been around nerds a lot. So it wasn't that shocking. In a way, it actually felt like I was home.
It's kind of like a Mission Impossible thing, and like the mask was coming off.
Yeah, it was like, wow, these are my people. So, I mean, the love of backpacks is obvious. I made a little joke about it there. Yep. But I think one thing that's really important to note is that the stereotype of being some crusty, you know, skinny white guy in his mum's basement with an energy drink has like completely disappeared. Developing is becoming a lot more broad. It's a lot more inclusive. And of course, there's still that stereotype there, but really you get all kinds in this profession. And that's what makes it really great. And I want to see that happen more and more.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Cool. So if we could just finish off by bringing Ian back on. Yeah.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Hey, hi there. So we don't have any questions in the list for like the team bit at the end, but I'll just ask one of my own then. So you've both been dealing with complexity and new things and new documentation or absent documentation or whatever. And, you know, I think both of you, made reference to the fact that, developers are people who volunteer to do homework for the rest of their lives, and there are days when it's just not working and you're slamming your head off the keyboard and you've got QWERTY, along here. So just from each of you, what are your top tips for fighting through that, or what strategies do you use for coping with the bad days?
Yeah, do you want me to go first? Or?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, okay. I think take a step back a bit. I think people tend to get frustrated at the problem. So I think first step is 2 baby steps. So you have all these tools at your disposal. You have a debugger. You have documentation if it's good. So use the tools that you have at your disposal and just break the problem down into smaller baby steps. That's how I approach every problem.
Cool. Brilliant.
Yeah, that's cannot disagree with that. That's actually something that I I tend to struggle with is actually taking that baby step approach. So it's something that I've really had to work on. So that's a really, really important point. I also found I work in a really great company and a great team, and emotion isn't off the table. So we have a really open dialogue with each other, especially now during lockdown times, about what we're struggling with personally and what thoughts we have in our minds, and that even though we love our work, sometimes it's just an awful day or an awful week. I mean, I just had one of those this week. So for me, of course, every workplace is different. And of course, you've got friends and family at home. But having a really open dialogue with your colleagues that extends just beyond your professional front, I find is really, really invaluable.
Brilliant. Excellent. So I think that's a wonderful note to leave it on. So listen, thank both of you. Thank you very, very much indeed for 2 wonderful talks. And just to say to the audience, thank you everybody for turning up. And we hope to do this again soon. And if you have any suggestions or you would like to do a talk, so please get in touch. Otherwise, thank you everybody so much, and hope to see you next time.
Yeah.
Thanks
Bye.
Bye.